Tonight we drift back, farther than memory, farther than the first pyramid or even the first grain of desert sand. We drift to the edge of nothingness, when there was no Nile, no pharaoh, not even the whisper of wind over stone. Just stillness, and a darkness so vast it made even the stars, if they had existed, feel shy about shining. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. In the beginning, there was Noon, the boundless, swirling ocean of chaos. Not the calm, tropical kind of ocean you'd want to float across with a cocktail, but an infinite black, weightless flood of possibility. Out of that endless water rose a single spark of will, Autumn. Some say he formed himself from a mound of mud that lifted above the waves. Others that he simply thought himself into being. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians imagined this primeval mound as a literal place, perhaps inspired by the way fertile earth appears after the Nile's yearly flood, or as something purely divine. Autumn, lonely and luminous, stood on that first mound and decided to create company. How he did so depends on which temple you ask. In one version, he sneezed out Shu, the god of air, and spat out Tefnut, goddess of moisture. Yes, divine creation via cosmic sneeze. The universe apparently began with bad allergies. In another, he used words, or even his own shadow, shaping the air and the mist through will alone. Either way, from that intimate act, the first breath and first dew entered existence. With air and moisture came balance. Shu lifted, Tefnut descended, and together they gave structure to the chaos. When they looked out upon the horizon, the darkness softened, because, for the first time, there was space between things. The Egyptians would later see this as the foundation of all creation. The idea that life exists in separation, that every sunrise, every breath, depends on boundaries being maintained. The pair wandered off into the void, exploring what it meant to exist. When they did not return, Autumn grew anxious. Imagine being the only god in the universe and realizing your children have ghosted you. So he tore out his eye, sending it across the void to search for them. That eye, infused with his essence, became one of Egypt's most enduring symbols, the Eye of Ra, the divine gaze that sees all. When Shu and Tefnut finally came back, the eye returned too, burning with jealousy that it had been replaced by a new one during its journey. To calm it, Autumn placed it upon his brow, where it would shine as the first sun. Light spilled over the waters of Noon, shimmering gold across the dark sea. For the Egyptians, this was the first dawn, the moment the world took a visible shape. And that light fell upon something extraordinary, the Nile, imagined in its mythic form. Even in the earliest myths, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was a pulse, a divine artery connecting heaven and earth. Its gentle rhythm mirrored the breathing of Shu. Its glistening surface reflected the tears of Tefnut. As the first sun rose over that sacred current, creation became real, warm, and alive. The Egyptians believed that every sunrise was a reenactment of that first moment. When the golden disk of the sun climbed over the horizon each morning, it wasn't just the start of a new day, it was autumn awakening again, shaking off the waters of chaos. The priests of Heliopolis would later tell this story through hymns, their words shimmering on temple walls. He rose from the flood, he who came to be of himself, Lord of all that he made. But creation never stops after the first spark. Once air and moisture had danced their duet, they gave birth to the next generation, earth and sky, Geb and Nut. But at this early hour in our story, they have not arrived. The world is still in its fragile infancy, half shadow, half shimmer. Imagine standing there, barefoot on the first island of creation. The ground is warm from newborn sunlight, but cool beneath your toes, as if still remembering the touch of noon's eternal waters. In the distance, the horizon bends like a bowl of copper, and from the silence you can almost hear the heartbeat of the gods themselves. This wasn't just myth for the Egyptians. It was a way of understanding the rhythm of their world. Every year when the Nile flooded and then receded, it mimicked this cosmic story: chaos and rebirth, destruction and renewal. They didn't just farm beside the river, they worshipped through it. The annual flood wasn't a nuisance, it was noon visiting again, cleansing the earth before letting autumn's sunlight return. One quirky tidbit from Egyptian belief: some priests claimed that the Nile's water was not just divine, but it was literally the sweat of the god Ra as he toiled across the sky each day. Others thought it flowed straight from the underworld, carrying blessings from the dead. Whichever story you prefer, it certainly made bath time feel more spiritual. The ancient city of Heliopolis, the City of the Sun, became the main stage for this creation myth. Its obelisks were said to mark the very spot where autumn first stood. Archaeologists have uncovered fragments of hymns there, and even now when the desert wind brushes across those stones, it's easy to imagine a whisper, something older than language, murmuring of that first morning. Historians still argue whether these myths were first told in Heliopolis or spread there later from older cults. Some think they grew out of simple observations of the Nile and its flood cycles. Others believe they were sophisticated theological systems long before writing existed. What's certain is that they endure because they describe something timeless, the feeling of beginning. The Egyptians believed creation wasn't a one-time event, it was ongoing. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every breath of wind over the reeds was the universe reasserting its existence against chaos. They took the world for granted. It was a daily miracle, held together by the delicate cooperation of gods, mortals, and the eternal Nile. As night begins to fold again over that newborn land, the waters of noon retreat to the edges of the horizon, shimmering like oil on stone. Autumn watches the sky turn from gold to indigo, the first stars blinking awake. They say he smiled then, because, even in the dark, he could see reflections of what he had made. And as he drifted to rest upon his sacred mound, he whispered the promise that would echo across every temple, every tomb, every age of Egypt's long memory: I shall rise again. The first dawn still glowed across the horizon, that tender shimmer between shadow and light. The waters of Nun had grown calm, their surface reflecting the newborn sun like liquid bronze. And upon that tranquil stage, Atum, the self-created one, took a breath that rippled through the void. It was a breath that would not just move air, but summon generations of gods to come. The Egyptians imagined this next part like a cosmic family reunion, except no one quite knew the rules yet. From that single spark of consciousness came Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of moisture. In a sense, they were the universe's first siblings, and their arrival changed everything. Shu brought space, the invisible expanse that separates and defines. Tefnut brought the soft weight of water, the nurturing humidity that clings to all living things. Together, they were balance, the dry and the damp, the breath and the dew, the eternal inhalation of creation itself. Atum, proud but weary, watched as his children danced through the stillness. They moved in wide circles, testing the edges of their existence. Sometimes the ancient texts say they wandered too far, swallowed up by the darkness of none. Atum, frantic, sent forth his eye to search for them once more, the same blazing symbol that had found them before. When it returned, bringing his children home, Atum wept tears of joy. From those tears, legend says, humankind was born. So yes, in the Egyptian view of things, humanity owes its existence to divine parental relief. The myth was not just poetic, it was deeply symbolic. The Egyptians looked at the world and saw patterns, the rivers rise and fall, the shifting of seasons, the way birth followed struggle and rest followed birth. To them, Shu and Tefnut represented the first laws of the cosmos, air and moisture, the invisible forces without which life could not bloom. With time, their union gave birth to another pair, Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. You can picture them not as distant deities, but as living landscapes. Geb, a green, reclining figure covered in fertile fields. Nut, a graceful arch of stars bending protectively over him. Ancient Egyptian art captured this vividly. Nut's body, dark blue and spangled with constellations, stretching from horizon to horizon, while Geb lay beneath her, laughing as life burst from his skin. Between them stood Shu, the loyal air god, arms raised to hold them apart. The story says Nut and Geb loved each other too deeply, clinging together so tightly that nothing could exist between them. The world remained dark and airless. Atum, seeing that creation had stalled, ordered Shu to separate them, to lift Nut into the heavens and pressed Geb down into the earth. It was an act both sorrowful and necessary, the first heartbreak written into the structure of the world. When Nut was lifted high, her tears fell as rain upon Geb, and from that gentle sorrow the plants began to grow. Rivers began to trickle across his body, carving out valleys and shaping the Nile's eternal path. Shu's hands trembled beneath the weight of the heavens, but he stood firm, the everlasting pillar between sky and earth. Every gust of wind, the Egyptians said, was his sigh, a soft, weary exhale of duty. Historians still argue whether the myth of Nut and Geb predates the temples of Heliopolis or grew later from regional variations of sky and earth deities. Some early inscriptions hint that the roles were reversed at one point, the sky as male, the earth as female. But in Egypt's settled civilization, it made sense that the earth, fertile and solid, was masculine, while the sky, embracing and mysterious, was feminine. The myth of their separation carried deep emotional weight. The Egyptians didn't just see this as a cosmic origin, they felt it. Every sunset, Nut swallowed the sun, drawing it into her belly, and every dawn she gave birth to it again. The night was her time of pregnancy, the day her moment of labor. That daily cycle wasn't just astronomy, it was divine motherhood on repeat. Atum, now often equated with Ra, the sun itself, rode across Nut's body each day in his golden bark, like a fiery scarab crawling along her spine. As he reached the western horizon, she bent low and swallowed him whole, beginning his nightly journey through the underworld. It's oddly comforting to imagine the sun as a traveler, a god who dies each evening only to be reborn by morning, a cosmic metaphor for resilience and maybe the earliest bedtime reassurance that even the darkest night will end. And so the divine family tree grew roots and branches. Geb and Nut's union brought forth 4 children: Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. But that's for later in our journey. For now, the heavens and earth were finally in place. Creation had acquired structure: the land to walk upon, the sky to gaze into, the air to breathe, and the moisture to nurture. One curious detail rarely mentioned outside temple texts: the Egyptians sometimes described the Milky Way as Nut's breast milk, flowing across the night sky to nourish the world below. It's an image at once strange and deeply tender, an ancient way of saying that even the stars themselves nourish life. In those early myths, every part of existence had personality. The Nile's rise was Geb stretching after sleep. The morning dew was Tefnut's laughter. The wind rustling through reeds was Shu whispering to his sister. For people living thousands of years before modern science, this worldview turned nature into an intimate conversation. The world wasn't cold or indifferent. It was alive, emotional, full of relationships and meaning. As we drift further into this ancient dreamscape, imagine standing on the bank of that first Nile. The water glimmers under a sky newly arched by Nut's body, while the earth beneath your feet hums with Geb's warmth. Above, Shu's invisible presence separates and connects everything, the silent mediator of existence. The air tastes clean, untouched, as if each breath still remembers being created. In that stillness, Atum's work is complete, for now. He watches his descendants fill the world with movement and sound, with rivers and winds and growing things. Somewhere deep in the cosmic memory, the waters of none still stir, waiting, as if chaos itself is holding its breath, watching the new gods awaken. And beneath that vast starlit sky, the first stories of love, rebellion, and rebirth are waiting, ready to begin their eternal rhythm. The world was no longer silent. The first breeze had learned to whisper. The first rain had begun to fall. Above it all, Nut arched across the heavens, her skin a deep indigo, scattered with the diamonds of early stars. Beneath her lay Geb, broad-shouldered and patient, his laughter rumbling through the valleys like distant thunder. Between them, Shu stood, arms raised eternally, the breath of air that held love and duty apart. The Egyptians imagined this cosmic tableau every day and night. You could see it on temple ceilings, Nut's body bending gracefully across the plaster, fingers and toes touching the horizon, while Geb, painted green, reclined below, smiling through fields of wheat and lotus. But to them, it wasn't just art. It was the first drama. The first forbidden love story written across the fabric of creation itself. For though Nut and Geb adored each other, their embrace once threatened to smother the world. When Atum, now Ra, the great sun, saw that their union left no room for life, he commanded Shu to pry them apart. It was an act of necessary cruelty. Shu stretched, trembling, pushing Nut up and Geb down, his arms becoming the pillars of air that would forever divide heaven from earth. The lovers cried out, but the decree was final. Still, Nut's tears fell as rain onto Geb, and his laughter became the rumble of thunder in response. Every drop, every storm, was a reminder that though separated, they could still touch through sorrow and sound. It's the kind of love story that's tragic, but strangely comforting, the kind that says even distance can't destroy connection. Of course, divine defiance always follows divine law. Nut, ever rebellious, found a way to keep her love alive. She learned that she was pregnant with the children of Geb, but Ra, furious that creation might expand beyond his control, cursed her. You shall not give birth in any month of the year. Now for most beings, that would have been the end of it, but Nut was not most beings. She turned to Thoth, the clever moon god, for help. Thoth, with the slyness of a scribe who knew how to bend rules rather than break them, challenged the moon god Khonsu to a game of Senet, a sort of divine board game of fate. He played with skill, wit, and maybe a touch of divine trickery, winning enough moonlight to create 5 extra days, days that existed outside the normal calendar. On those secret days, Nut gave birth to her children, Osiris, Isis, Set, Nephthys, and later Horus the Elder. It's one of the earliest examples of cosmic loopholing, a gentle reminder that rules, even divine ones, can be rewritten with enough cleverness and a good game night. Historians still argue whether this myth about the 5 epigomenal days originated as a theological story or a practical explanation for Egypt's 365-day solar calendar. But either way, it tied human time to cosmic drama. Every year, those extra days were considered dangerous, sacred, and unpredictable. The days when gods were born and chaos briefly ruled. And so, the first boundaries of creation, the air, the sky, the earth, became not just divisions, but symbols of longing, defiance, and renewal. Nut's body arched across the world like a living bridge between light and dark, her belly carrying the stars themselves. Each night she swallowed the sun, and each morning she birthed him anew, the most divine recycling program imaginable. The Egyptians saw every sunrise as her triumph over darkness. Even when Ra scolded her, even when chaos nipped at the edges of the sky, Nut carried him safely through the 12 hours of the night. In those dark hours, he traveled through her starry body, encountering serpents, guardians, and gates, what later texts would call the Duat, the underworld. But for now, in these earliest myths, the Duat was still forming, half dream, half shadow, a realm between breaths. Meanwhile, down on Earth, Geb continued to nurture all living things. His laughter shook mountains, his tears fed the rivers, and his body sprouted forests and fields. Yet he too carried longing. Sometimes, when the earth trembled, the Egyptians said it was Geb laughing or crying for Nut. The ground's heartbeat was his, and it reminded mortals that even gods feel the ache of separation. One of the quirkier beliefs about Nut and Geb was that earthquakes weren't just natural disasters. They were Geb's giggles, ripples of joy whenever Nut bent low to kiss him at the horizon. Ancient texts describe how priests would perform calming rituals when the earth shook, gently asking Geb to control his laughter. It's a charmingly human interpretation that even geological instability was an act of divine affection. But divine love is never without consequences. When Nut bore her 5 children in secret, she set in motion the next great wave of mythic drama, the struggle between order and chaos that would echo through every dynasty of Egypt. Her children would embody every aspect of the human condition: love and jealousy, justice and betrayal, resurrection and vengeance. Still, in these first generations, everything was intimate, elemental. The gods were family, not yet distant idols. They quarreled, comforted, and conspired like mortals, just on the celestial scale. Their stories gave shape to emotions the Egyptians already understood: longing, anger, pride, and tenderness. When someone gazed up at the Milky Way, they didn't just see a river of stars, they saw Nut's outstretched arms. When they felt the tremor beneath their feet, they imagined Geb stirring. And between them, Shu's endless labor continued. He was the least dramatic of the three, but perhaps the most heroic, an invisible god who held the balance of everything. The Egyptians believed the wind itself was his breath. On still, hot nights, when the air refused to move, people whispered prayers for Shu to exhale again, to remind them the world hadn't fallen still. Historians still argue whether Shu's role was ever more active. Some old hymns suggest he once fought serpents of chaos alongside Ra, but in the most enduring version, he remains still, eternal, reliable, the quiet backbone of creation, a god of restraint in a world of passion. As the night deepens, you can almost feel that balance in your own breath. Inhale, Shu. Exhale, Tefnet. The same rhythm that began creation still echoes inside every living thing. And somewhere far above, Nut curves across the dark, her body glittering with stars. She looks down at Geb, and though they can never touch fully again, they find comfort in their rhythm. Sunrise, sunset, rainfall, laughter. Creation may have required separation, but love, it seems, found a way to persist. It's fitting, perhaps, that the world began not with war or conquest, but with longing, because in Egypt's cosmic story, even the gods were ruled not by dominance, but by connection. And in that soft, shimmering tension between heaven and earth, the stage is set for the gods to become as flawed, fascinating, and fragile as the mortals who would later worship them. From the union of sky and earth came four divine siblings, four forces that would shape not just the heavens, but the human heart. Their births, whispered into existence across Nut's forbidden 5 days, brought color, tension, and destiny into the once stable world. The quiet hum of creation began to tremble, and for the first time, the universe knew conflict. The first to emerge was Osiris, tall and radiant, with skin the color of fertile soil. He embodied order, life, and rebirth, the green pulse of the Nile itself. Wherever he walked, plants bloomed, rivers shimmered, and the air seemed to hum with balance. To the Egyptians, Osiris represented civilization, the part of humanity that builds, governs, and remembers that kindness can be a form of power. Next came Isis, his sister and eventual consort, born with eyes bright as morning dew and wisdom deeper than the underworld. She was the goddess of magic, healing, and devotion, a woman whose words could turn death into silence and silence into life. Her name would one day echo in temples from Thebes to Rome, carved into amulets worn by sailors and queens alike. If Osiris was the body of order, Isis was its breath. Then came Set, the stormbringer. His birth split the calm with a roar of wind and dust. His hair was the color of blood and desert sand, his temper unpredictable as lightning. Set was chaos, not evil exactly, but the necessary force that tests all structure. In a universe built on balance, chaos must have a seat at the table. Still, Set's shadow would stretch long and dark before this story was done. Last of the siblings was Nephthys, quiet and mysterious. She was the dusk between day and night, the shadow beside the flame. While Isis drew worship and Set drew fear, Nephthys watched from the margins, a protector of tombs, a comforter of the lost, a sister to both light and darkness. She would later be known as the companion of the dead, her presence softening the sting of endings. Together, these four embodied the human condition: love, envy, jealousy, loyalty, and the aching desire for purpose. And as they came of age, Egypt's mythic world grew layered and unpredictable, like the Nile Delta itself, fertile in some seasons, destructive in others. The bond between Osiris and Isis became legendary. In temple hymns, they were called the perfect pair, the king and queen of heaven and earth. Under their rule, Egypt prospered. Osiris taught humans how to plant grain, brew beer, and build cities along the river's edge. Isis taught them medicine, prayer, and the mysteries of language. Together, they turned survival into civilization. It's said that when Osiris reigned, the Nile rose exactly when it should. Fields yielded harvests without fail. Even the animals seemed calmer, the crocodiles drifting lazily instead of lunging for anything that moved. The Egyptians later imagined his time as a golden age, when gods and mortals shared the same table. But the desert does not love the flood, and Set, lord of the red lands, storms, and searing winds, watched this order with restless eyes. He ruled the barren stretches where sand drowned sound, and heat shimmered like mirages. Where Osiris's kingdom pulsed with green life, Set's domain was silence and dust. The contrast gnawed at him. Historians still argue whether Set was originally a villain or a misunderstood force of nature. Early inscriptions paint him as a necessary god, the one who defended Ra's solar bark each night from the serpent Apethys. But later stories turned him darker, jealous, the embodiment of imbalance. Perhaps it was simply that chaos once invited can't be easily dismissed. Even Isis's affection couldn't bridge the rift between her brothers. She loved Set as kin, but trusted Osiris as king. The difference was everything. And so, as Osiris ruled and Isis healed, Set plotted. Not yet murder, that would come soon, but something subtler, pesting the boundaries of divine harmony. Meanwhile, Nephthys found herself drawn toward both brothers. She married Set, though their union was passionless, a pairing of storm and shadow. Yet one night, disguised in Isis's likeness, she lay with Osiris. From that deception came Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming, who would later guide souls to the afterlife. A child of confusion, born between fidelity and betrayal, Anubis became the bridge between life and death. This quiet scandal rippled through the divine household, though not with fury, at least not yet. The gods, like the humans who would later mirror them, seemed endlessly forgiving until jealousy found the cracks. Osiris continued his reign, unaware of how fragile it had become. He traveled far, teaching neighboring lands the ways of agriculture and law. Wherever he went, people built shrines to honor him. When he returned to Egypt, the world was in bloom, but so too was Set's resentment. One curious fragment from the pyramid texts describes Set as he who loves thunder but hates rain, a poetic contradiction, and perhaps the purest symbol of his nature. He adored power, but despised its peace. To him, Osiris's harmony wasn't glory, it was stagnation. And so the tension between brothers, between fertile green and burning red, became a living metaphor. The Nile and the desert, life and death, order and chaos. The Egyptians didn't need to invent this duality. They saw it daily. Each morning the river's mist blurred into the horizon's dry heat, a reminder that balance is never permanent. It's a truce renewed by willpower. In temples and tombs, priests whispered the lessons hidden in this celestial family. They said, "To build is divine, but to test the builder is also divine." In other words, even gods needed rivals to remain strong. But rivalry, once awakened, rarely sleeps quietly. One quirky tidbit from later folklore claims that Set's animal, a creature with a snout like a jackal, ears like a donkey, and tail like a forked serpent, was so strange that no one could ever identify it. Even the Egyptians called it Shah, the mysterious one, perhaps fitting for a god who embodied the unknown itself. As the four siblings grew into their roles, Egypt's cosmic balance began to shimmer with tension. Ra still ruled the sky, sailing his solar bark by day and journeying through Nut's body by night. But on Earth, the seeds of divine conflict were already sprouting. For in the lush fields of Osiris's kingdom, order flourished. And just beyond the horizon, in the dry breath of the desert, Set watched and waited. The harmony that Atum had once sung into existence was beginning to hum off-key. Love, envy, loyalty, deception. They had all been born from Nut's defiance. The gods were no longer symbols alone. They had become personalities. And with personality comes pride. In that subtle tremor, the shift of wind across the dunes, the sigh of air between heaven and earth, the universe leaned forward, listening, because soon the balance of creation would be tested for the first time. The world had grown rich with color by the time Osiris reigned. A green shimmer across the valley, reeds whispering along the Nile, and the laughter of mortals echoing like distant birds. Osiris was not just a god of fertility, he was the pulse of the land itself. Under his rule, Egypt learned to sow, reap, and live in rhythm with the river. They said even the stars aligned in joy above his throne. And yet, as every mythologist knows, nothing glows so steadily that shadow doesn't creep in. Set watched his brother's harmony with a mixture of fascination and something sharper. While Osiris was garlanded in praise, Set ruled the wild edges, the red desert, the storm, the roaring sand where nothing gentle grows. His realm was chaos incarnate, and chaos does not rest quietly while order thrives. Historians still argue whether Set's envy was born from loneliness or from the raw imbalance between their dominions. Either way, resentment began to crackle like heat over stone. Osiris, ever trusting, never noticed. He walked among his people, blessing their harvests, teaching the sacred rites that would echo through millennia. He was the first king, and Isis his queen, a goddess whose intelligence rivaled the stars she mapped. Together, they formed the model of divine partnership. She was the hidden power behind the throne, weaving spells of protection and fertility. Her devotion was fierce, her patience endless. And somewhere in the background, Set's laughter, brittle, hollow, began to twist into plotting. The ancient storytellers loved the drama of this divine family. They said Set, cunning as a desert fox, crafted a chest of exquisite beauty, carved from the rarest cedar, lined with gold, inlaid with lapis, so deep it seemed to hold the night sky itself. He threw a grand feast, inviting gods and mortals alike, music and perfume filling the air. Between toasts, he presented the glittering chest and declared with a smile, "Whosoever fits perfectly within shall keep it forever." You can already guess where this is going. Osiris, ever the good sport, stepped forward, laughing with the crowd. He lay down within, and, of course, it fit him exactly. The moment he did, Set's expression hardened. The lid slammed shut, nails hammered down, molten lead poured to seal it tight. No divine light escaped, no plea was heard. The room fell silent, except for the thud as Set's followers heaved the coffin into the dark waters of the Nile. The murder of Osiris was the first great tragedy of Egyptian myth. The moment when life was betrayed by its own kin. The Nile, once serene, seemed to rage that night. Fishermen swore the current changed course. Birds fled the riverbanks. Even the moon dimmed in mourning. And in her palace, Isis felt her heart twist. Her beloved was gone, and with him the balance of the world. But Isis was no passive widow. The myths speak of her wandering far and wide, her hair unbound, her feet bleeding for the search. In the reeds of the delta, she found fragments of Osiris's story whispered by sympathetic spirits. She followed the trail through villages and deserts, across foreign lands, until she found the chest washed ashore near Bybelos. There, it had become part of a foreign king's pillar, absorbed into his palace walls. Historians still debate whether this reflects an ancient Egyptian trade myth about cedar imports or something deeper, a metaphor for how life hides within the structures of death. Isis, ever clever, disguised herself as a humble woman and entered the palace. Through her quiet magic, she won the queen's favor, until one night her true power was revealed. Flames of transformation surrounded the pillar, and with sacred chants she retrieved the chest. She fled back to Egypt, carrying Osiris's coffin under starlight, determined to bring him home. For a brief moment, it seemed she succeeded. With her spells, her tears, and her breath, Isis brought Osiris back, not to full life, but to awareness. Long enough for them to embrace again, for him to whisper wisdom to her, for their son Horus to be conceived beneath the wings of resurrection. But their joy was short-lived. Set, ever the storm, found them again. In a fury, he tore Osiris's body apart, scattering the pieces across Egypt so that no resurrection could ever be complete. Some myths say 14 pieces, others 16. The precise number, fittingly, remains a point of scholarly debate. What matters is that Isis refused to give up. With Nephthys, Set's own wife and Isis's shadow twin, she began the slow and sorrowful task of gathering Osiris together again. Every site she visited became sacred. Abydos, Dendera, Mendes, each claimed to hold one fragment of the god. Some towns built shrines around the relics, declaring their own piece the heart, or the head, or the secret organ of rebirth. Yes, even the one that, legend says, she could not find, replaced instead by a golden facsimile. The ancients had their sense of humor. At last, Osiris was whole again, if only symbolically. Isis performed the first mummification, wrapping him in linen, anointing him with sacred oils, speaking the words that would open the path to the next world. This ritual, said to be the origin of all Egyptian funerary practice, marked the shift from life to eternity. Osiris would no longer rule the living, but he would reign forever over the dead. And so, beneath the earth, Osiris became the Lord of the Duat, the green-skinned god who sits in judgment over souls, the silent presence behind every tomb and temple prayer. His death and rebirth set the pattern for all human mortality: decay, remembrance, transformation. Every Egyptian burial thereafter echoed this myth, a promise that endings are only the doorway to another kind of light. Above, the living carried on. Isis hid their son Horus among the marshes. The wind whispered his destiny. The Nile glimmered with both loss and expectation. And somewhere far in the desert, Set storms still raged, triumphant for now, but not forever. Because, as every listener knows, no night lasts without dawn. Isis wandered beneath a sun that seemed to burn without warmth, across sands that shimmered like broken glass. Every step she took carried the ache of loss and the pulse of divine purpose. The land, too, seemed to feel it. Crops withered, rivers slowed, and the laughter of mortals faded. For when Osiris fell, the heartbeat of the world faltered with him. His sister wife, the goddess of magic, healing, and the moon's quiet wisdom, became the lone thread holding the cosmos from unraveling. Her grief was vast, but not directionless. Wrapped in linen and determination, Isis moved through Egypt as both wanderer and priestess. In every village, people whispered her name, sometimes as a goddess in disguise, other times as a mourning woman who blessed their sick or saved their dying children. She carried the scent of myrrh and lotus, and her presence lingered long after she passed. Some legends say the Nile itself rose higher as she walked beside it, responding to her sorrow with floods that brought renewal instead of destruction. Historians still argue whether these wandering tales of Isis were inspired by real ceremonial processions, where priestesses reenacted her journey each year. But even stripped of ritual, her story hums with the universal ache of love-defying loss. In the myth, Isis begins her search guided by faint whispers, the cries of the desert wind, the hum of the stars, the distant song of frogs returning after the flood. She listens. That was always her power, not brute force, but the magic of attention. She senses Osiris in the living pulse of the world, in the rush of the river, the green of papyrus, the sigh of the reeds. And with each clue she discovers one fragment of his broken body. The first she finds, they say, near Abydos. There, half buried in the silt, lay the heart of Osiris, still glowing faintly, pulsing like a seed that refuses to die. She knelt, whispering ancient words, wrapping it in linen scented with cedar and honey. It was not merely grief that guided her hands, but invention, the art of preservation. What humans would later call mummification began in that moment. She moved from place to place, Dendera, Busiris, Mendes, and beyond, gathering what was lost. In each region she performed rites to sanctify the ground, planting the seed of what would become Egypt's temple network. Every site claimed, "Here lies a piece of Osiris," and in a way, all were right. His presence spread like pollen, woven into the landscape itself. At one point, Isis sought help from the scorpion goddess Serket, protector of the vulnerable. The story goes that 7 sacred scorpions guarded Isis as she crossed the delta disguised as a peasant woman. When a rich woman refused her shelter, the scorpions took vengeance, their sting burning down the woman's house. Yet Isis, merciful even in sorrow, healed the woman's child, showing that compassion was stronger than rage. A small papyrus spell from later centuries even invokes Isis of the 7 scorpions to protect children from fever, proof that her myth seeped into daily life like a blessing. One by one, the pieces of Osiris returned to her. Each recovery was marked by a prayer, a new spell, or a charm, what the ancients called Heka, the raw fabric of divine speech. Isis's magic wasn't about waving wands or summoning lightning. It was about understanding names, the true names of things, which held the essence of creation itself. But not all was smooth. Set, ever suspicious, sent winds and beasts to thwart her. In some versions, he transformed himself into a black boar and destroyed the crops she passed. In others, he unleashed serpents to strike her in her sleep. Isis countered each threat with spells that soothed venom and calmed tempests. One of her incantations, a prayer against snakebite, survives in temple walls even today. Imagine that. A mother thousands of years later whispering a line that Isis once murmured to the sand. There was one fragment of Osiris she could not find. Some say it was lost in the Nile, swallowed by fish, a strangely human detail that always makes scholars smile. Ancient priests actually banned the eating of certain fish in Osiris's honor, claiming they had swallowed the missing part of the god. Whether literal or symbolic, it shows how myth bled into ritual, turning grief into custom. Yet Isis refused to leave even one piece unaccounted for. So she fashioned the missing part from gold, restoring Osiris's body to wholeness, a symbolic perfection that transcended mortality. Then, in silence, she wrapped him, layer upon layer of linen soaked in oils and resin, the smell of eternity filling the air. She chanted over each bandage, speaking life into death. Some say the first ankh, the symbol of life, glowed in her hand as she worked. When she was done, she fanned her wings, great shimmering feathers that stretched like twilight over the tomb. She sang to him not as goddess to god, but as lover to lover. Her voice, they said, could coax the moon to rise and the dead to remember warmth. Through her song and her breath, Osiris stirred, not fully alive, but awakened. He opened his eyes, saw her face, and smiled. For a brief moment, the world stood still. In that sacred instant, they conceived their child, Horus, the falcon who would one day avenge his father and reclaim balance for the living. Osiris's light dimmed again soon after, drawn to the underworld that awaited him. But before he vanished, he whispered knowledge to Isis, the secret laws of life and death, the mysteries of the afterlife, the rhythm of rebirth. And thus, through her grief, Isis invented more than resurrection. She gave humanity the map of eternity. The embalming, the tombs, the prayers written on coffin lids, all traced back to her journey, to a goddess who refused to accept finality. It's funny, in a cosmic sort of way. From the greatest heartbreak came the promise of immortality. From one woman's sorrow came the civilization's defining ritual. And if you've ever stood before the golden mask of a pharaoh and wondered why his face smiles so serenely, perhaps it's because he knows who will greet him when his spirit crosses the veil. The same goddess who searched the earth for love and found, instead, eternity. The reeds whispered like gossiping spirits that night, the air thick with mist, the moon glinting silver across the Nile. Hidden deep within the marshes of Hemis, far from Set's watchful eyes, Isis lay upon a bed of papyrus and river grass. Her pain mingled with the hiss of frogs and the hum of night insects, while the crocodiles drifted near, silent sentinels beneath the water's skin. The world held its breath, and in that moment between darkness and dawn, the goddess gave birth to Horus, the falcon child, the heir of light, and the seed of vengeance. It wasn't an ordinary birth, of course. The myths say that as she cried out, the stars flickered like lamps being lit, and lotus flowers bloomed across the marsh as if to soften her pain. A cool wind carried the scent of river mud and new life. And even the crocodiles, those ancient armored beasts, bowed their heads in respect. The boy who arrived was small, fragile, and glowing faintly with divine warmth. Isis held him close, pressing her lips to his forehead, whispering words of protection that had not yet been spoken by mortal tongues. But there was no time to rest. Set was still abroad, his fury spreading through the land like wildfire. He had murdered once and would do so again to preserve his stolen throne. So Isis, ever cunning, cloaked herself and her child in secrecy. She built a reed hut among the marshes, where the river curved like a serpent, and lived quietly, mother, goddess, and fugitive. Every night she kindled a small flame to keep away the chill, and every day she whispered spells over Horus's cradle. The ancient texts call them Heka, words woven from the fabric of creation itself. One of the oldest surviving magical papyri even includes a spell titled Isis protects her child Horus from the scorpions, showing how deeply this myth was woven into Egyptian life. Mothers for centuries would murmur the same incantations over their own children, trusting that Isis's magic might echo across time. The marsh became their sanctuary and their testing ground. Horus grew up surrounded by the wild's raw lessons, crocodiles gliding in the shallows, ibises picking their way along the mud, serpents coiled like moving hieroglyphs. The goddess Circuit and the 7 sacred scorpions guarded the hut, their stingers shimmering faintly under moonlight. Whenever danger crept close, a snake, a fever, or the shadow of Set's spies, Isis would extend her hands over Horus and sing the old songs of healing. One tale says that when Horus was still a small boy, he was bitten by a scorpion while playing among the reeds. His body went still, his breath faltered, and even the river seemed to freeze. Desperate, Isis lifted him high and cried to the gods, to Ra, to Thoth, to every divine ear that might hear her. Her tears fell into the water and became the morning dew. Thoth, moved by her devotion, descended in the form of an ibis and spoke the words that restored the child's life. This story became one of Egypt's most sacred healing myths, a reminder that love, spoken aloud, could conquer even death. Historians still debate whether the marsh exile of Isis reflects ancient traditions of hidden shrines, secret sanctuaries where initiates learned divine mysteries. What's certain is that her seclusion gave Egypt one of its most enduring symbols, the image of a mother nursing her divine child. You've seen it, perhaps, carved in stone, Isis seated on a throne, Horus suckling at her breast. It's an image that centuries later would echo in depictions of the Madonna and child, proof that tenderness transcends cultures and epics alike. But for now, tenderness had to coexist with danger. Set spies roamed the land in animal form. Jackals, serpents, falcons corrupted by red dust. Each time they drew near, the marsh stirred in Isis's defense. The crocodile god Sobek, impressed by her courage, sent his kin to guard the waterways. Imagine that. Great reptiles floating just beyond the reeds, jaws glinting, eyes like golden stones. Not predators this time, but protectors. Egypt was never short on poetic irony. As Horus grew, he learned from more than his mother. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, appeared at dawns and dusks, teaching the boy the ways of words, time, and truth. To speak truly, Thoth told him, is to shape reality. Horus listened, his falcon eyes sharp, his spirit fierce yet restrained. For though vengeance glowed in his veins, Isis made him promise patience. "Not yet," she whispered each night. "The river must rise before it can strike." And so the years unfolded quietly, though quietly is relative when you're raising a divine child in a swamp. One legend says Horus once tried to mimic his father by raising his tiny hands to part the river, and succeeded a little too well, flooding half the marsh. Isis, amused and exasperated, scolded him gently. Even gods must learn to control their gifts. Every parent of a mischievous child can sympathize. Still, beneath her softness, Isis never forgot her mission. She kept a small altar in the corner of their hut, a bundle of linen, herbs, and symbols of Osiris. Each night she knelt before it, whispering to the unseen realm, "Watch him, my love. Your spirit flows through him." Some say Osiris heard, his voice traveling back through dreams and the rustle of reeds, guiding Horus even as he ruled the Duat. One evening, when the boy had grown strong enough to wield a simple reed spear, Isis led him to the water's edge. The moon glowed like a shield in the sky. She said, "Look," pointing at its reflection. "That light has seen everything, death, betrayal, and rebirth. You, my son, are its next reflection." She placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and sure. "When the time comes, you will face Set. Not in anger, but in balance. Remember, the world doesn't need victory. It needs harmony." Her words sank deep. The falcon in Horus stirred. He was still a boy, but his gaze held something ancient, a calm born from chaos. He practiced each day, swimming through the channels, learning the cries of birds, shaping his power with focus. By the time his wings of destiny began to unfurl, even the crocodiles deferred to him. And so in the hidden corners of the Nile, far from thrones and temples, the heir of Egypt was forged, not by crown or conquest, but by love, patience, and the quiet strength of a mother's magic. Someday soon, Set would hear of the boy in the marshes. Someday, vengeance would rise from the water, like dawn breaking the longest night. But for now the reeds swayed gently, the moonlight shimmered, and the goddess of magic cradled her sleeping son, a divine whisper against the endless hum of the river. The years ripened like figs along the Nile, and the quiet boy in the marshes grew into a falcon-eyed young god, tall, sharp, radiant with the fire of his father's spirit. By the time Horus emerged from his hiding place, the world above had changed. Set ruled Egypt's throne now, his temples rising from the desert in jagged splendor. Storms howled more often, harvests faltered, and mortals spoke of the red sand encroaching upon fertile fields. It was as if chaos itself sat on the throne of the living. But whispers began to drift across the land, whispers of a rightful heir, a falcon of the sky who could command the winds and calm the floods. Set, of course, heard them, and so began one of the strangest and most theatrical conflicts in all mythology, the battle for the throne of Egypt, part war, part trial, part cosmic courtroom drama. It's the mythic equivalent of a divine soap opera, complete with betrayal, slapstick moments, and even the gods getting impatient with paperwork. When Horus finally confronted Set, he did not stride in with rage. He arrived with the calm certainty of one who has learned patience from his mother. Yet their first meeting was anything but peaceful. Set, towering and red-haired, mocked him. A child raised among frogs and flies would challenge me? The desert will grind your feathers into dust. Horus simply looked at him and replied, "Even dust can rise when the wind remembers its purpose." The first clash was brutal. Horus, with his falcon's wings unfurled, soared above the battlefield, spear of light in hand. Set transformed into a monstrous hippopotamus, crashing through the river in waves that swallowed boats whole. They fought for days, the sky flashing with lightning, the Nile turning red with sunset reflections. Eventually, Isis intervened, not with violence, but strategy. She set a magical net across the waters to capture Set. But when he roared for mercy, she hesitated. Compassion was her flaw as well as her virtue. Horus, furious at her pity, struck out in anger and accidentally wounded her. It's a jarring moment, the son blinded by vengeance, harming the very mother who gave him life. The myths recorded differently depending on the era. Sometimes he decapitates her, only for Thoth to restore her head with that of a cow. Don't ask why mythology loves surreal head replacements. Other times, he merely storms off into exile. Either way, the emotional truth remains. Vengeance without compassion leads only to blindness. Blindness, as it happens, soon followed. In their next duel, Set gouged out Horus's eyes, tearing away the light itself. The young god stumbled through darkness, his wings folded, his faith shaken. Isis found him again, her grief renewed but her resolve unbroken. She called upon Thoth, the god of wisdom, who crafted a spell to restore Horus's sight. The light that returned was not ordinary light. It became the Eye of Horus, or Wajat, a symbol so potent it was painted on every coffin, carved into amulets and inked onto ships for protection. The story of loss and restoration had crystallized into one perfect emblem, the eternal promise that even after damage, wholeness can return. Historians still argue whether the Eye of Horus myth symbolized solar and lunar cycles, the waxing and waning of the moon as Horus's wounded and healed eyes. Whatever its roots, it became one of the most recognizable icons of Egyptian faith, an eternal reminder that suffering and healing were two halves of the same divine rhythm. But the fighting didn't stop there. The gods of Heliopolis, exasperated by the endless brawls, finally convened a divine tribunal to settle the matter once and for all. Picture it, a courtroom in the sky, where Ra presided like a weary judge, flanked by Thoth, Ma'at, and the assembled pantheon. Set stood defiantly in crimson armor, Horus, dignified and steady, beside his mother. The trial went on for 80 years. Yes, 80. Even the scribes who preserved the tale couldn't resist poking fun at the bureaucracy of it all. Witnesses were called, accusations hurled, tempers flared. At one point, Set offered to settle the matter through unconventional means, challenging Horus to transform into hippopotamuses and see who could stay submerged longer. Spoiler, they both nearly drowned. In another episode, Set tried to humiliate Horus through trickery involving a dinner party, some lettuce, and bodily fluids best left to the imagination. A scene so bizarre that Egyptologists have nicknamed it the lettuce incident. The moral, fortunately, is clear. Deceit only soils the deceiver. Isis, as always, outwitted Set by revealing the truth to the gods, turning his own scheme into a farce. Even Ra, the sun god himself, began to lose patience. How long, he thundered, must this quarrel darken the heavens? Yet he hesitated to dethrone Set, who was, after all, the embodiment of necessary chaos, the force that pushed back the serpent Apophis each night to keep the world turning. Egypt's mythic genius was never about pure good or evil, but about balance. Without Set, the storms would cease, and so would the floods that nourished life. Without Horus, order would crumble into tyranny. And so the court debated endlessly, balancing justice with necessity. Thoth, ever the scribe, recorded every argument with immaculate penmanship, though one imagines him sighing deeply through the centuries. Eventually, Isis once again tilted the scales. Disguising herself as an old woman, she approached Set as he rested beside the river. She told him a parable of a widow whose son's inheritance had been stolen by a cruel neighbor. Should the property be restored to the rightful heir, she asked. Of course, Set replied. Then you have judged yourself, she said, revealing her true form. When she presented this moment to the divine court, the gods murmured their approval. Even Ra smiled faintly. So be it, he declared. The throne of Egypt shall pass to Horus, son of Isis and Osiris. Set, though defeated, was not destroyed. In a rare act of divine grace, Horus spared him, or perhaps understood what Ra already knew, that chaos could never be erased, only balanced. Set was given dominion over the deserts and storms, where his tempests could rage without breaking the world. And so Horus ascended, the falcon soaring high, his eye gleaming with restored light, his wings spanning from horizon to horizon. The gods cheered, the Nile rose, and mortals looked up to see the sky painted with gold. The age of Osiris had ended, but the reign of Horus began, a reign not born of vengeance, but of equilibrium. From then on, every pharaoh claimed to be the living embodiment of Horus, the son who avenged his father, the king who ruled with both might and mercy. And when those pharaohs died, they became Osiris, descending to join the cycle anew. Order and chaos, death and rebirth, the endless duet of the Nile, written in divine blood and moonlight. Some say that even now, when storms break over the desert and the falcons cry at sunset, it's not just weather or bird song. It's Horus and Set still circling one another, testing, balancing, the eternal dance of night and dawn. In the hush of eternity, the river still flows, even through death. The Egyptians believed that life did not end with the final heartbeat. It merely changed its form, as the Nile changes its course, but never stops running. And so, as Osiris rose again, not to rule the living, but to govern the dead, the cosmic balance began to settle. In the shadowed world beneath the earth, a new kingdom bloomed. Osiris, draped in linen like a seed awaiting rebirth, sat upon a throne of gold and lapis lazuli. The air shimmered faintly with incense. The walls of his hall gleamed with hieroglyphs of justice. Around him gathered the gods who had witnessed his suffering, now preparing to build something enduring from his story. A system of judgment that would guide every mortal soul who dared to cross the threshold of death. It wasn't an easy job. There were, after all, countless human hearts to weigh. But Osiris, patient and steady, had learned from his own trials, the betrayal of Set, the love of Isis, the loyalty of Horus, that fairness must reign above all. So he created the Hall of Two Truths, where every soul would stand bare of title and wealth and face its own deeds. At the heart of that hall stood the great golden scales of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance. On one side lay her feather, a delicate plume, lighter than light itself. On the other, the heart of the departed. The test was simple, yet impossibly profound. If a person's heart weighed heavier than the feather, burdened with lies, cruelty, or greed, it was tossed to the waiting jaws of Aset, the fearsome devourer, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. And if the scales balanced perfectly, then the soul passed on, guided by Osiris himself, into the lush and endless fields of Aru, a paradise mirroring Egypt at its most perfect. Historians still argue whether this belief was meant to comfort or to control. Was it a moral compass, teaching people to live justly so their hearts stayed light? Or was it a cosmic bureaucracy, one that turned ethics into divine paperwork? Whatever the truth, it worked. Egyptians lived with an awareness that even the smallest act rippled into eternity. The Book of the Dead, those famous scrolls painted with scenes of the afterlife, acted like a spiritual user manual. Wealthy Egyptians were buried with them, their names and spells inscribed on fine papyrus to guide their souls safely through the trials of the afterlife. There were maps, passwords for guardian spirits, and even polite speeches to recite before divine judges, proof that bureaucracy might just be eternal. But here's the quirky part. Not everyone could afford such luxury. Some poorer Egyptians, unable to commission a full Book of the Dead, would write a single spell on a scrap of linen or pottery and tuck it into their wrappings, like leaving a note for the cosmic bouncer. It was a small hope that the gods would recognize sincerity over wealth. In that shimmering underworld, Osiris's judgment became the heartbeat of moral law. Even the gods abided by the principles of Ma'at. Without balance, the cosmos would crumble back into chaos, into the watery abyss of noon, where it had all begun. To live rightly was to help the sun rise, to keep the river flowing, to ensure the stars held their places in the night sky. The dead, however, did not travel this road alone. They were guided by Anubis, the jackal-headed god with coal-black fur and eyes like obsidian. Silent, meticulous, and oddly compassionate, he tended to the dead like a devoted craftsman. He anointed bodies, bound wrappings, whispered spells, and when the final moment came, it was he who carried the heart to the scales, like a priest presenting the evidence of a life. One ancient tomb painting shows Anubis bending over a mummy, his long fingers gently tucking the linen into place. Behind him, Osiris watches with calm authority, and Ma'at stands ready, her feather gleaming like morning light. It's not a scene of fear, but of precision, reverence, and order. That sense of order, Ma'at, was more than a goddess. She was a philosophy, a social contract, a cosmic rule book. The pharaohs claimed to embody her, promising to uphold balance on earth just as the gods did in heaven. In every courtroom, every harvest, every family meal, her spirit hovered, a reminder that fairness was divine. And yet, the Egyptians weren't naive. They knew life could be unfair. Floods ruined crops, rulers turned cruel, thieves escaped punishment. So the afterlife offered something Earth could not: ultimate justice. The cruel might prosper in life, but their hearts would sink like stones on the scales. The kind and humble might toil in anonymity, but their hearts would rise like the feather, untouched by deceit. It's a deeply human idea, one that still lingers in how we talk about conscience, judgment, and karma. The Egyptians just gave it a setting more theatrical than most. Golden scales, gods with falcon heads, and a crocodile monster named Eater of Hearts. Some modern Egyptologists suggest the ritual wasn't meant to terrify at all, but to reassure. Death to them was not an end, but a continuation of the same cosmic order that governed sunrise and harvest. You were weighed not to be punished, but to be measured by your harmony with the universe. And so the land of the dead was not dark and desolate. It was bright, fertile, and familiar. The fields of Aru shimmered with eternal sunlight, the Nile ran silver, and lotus flowers opened without end. Families were reunited, farmers tended perfect crops, and the gods walked among them like old friends. And meanwhile, in the world above, mortals built temples to Osiris, offering prayers to ensure that their loved ones had passed the test. In Abydos, priests reenacted his death and resurrection each year, turning grief into ritual, loss into meaning. The same waters that once carried Isis's tears now bore offerings of wine, bread, and flowers. And in every heart that beat beneath the desert sun, the lesson endured. Live truthfully, live lightly, live balanced. For someday, when you stand before Osiris, even the gods will listen as your heart speaks for you.
The sun had always been more than a light in the sky. It was life itself. To the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just a blazing sphere of fire, but a god, a traveler, a captain steering the fate of the world through day and night. His name was Ra, the great solar deity, whose eye blazed with divine intelligence, and whose daily voyage kept chaos at bay. Each morning, Ra was reborn on the eastern horizon, gliding across the sky in his golden bark. His ship was said to gleam brighter than any treasure buried in the Valley of the Kings. The gods sailed with him, sometimes Shu, the god of air, sometimes Hathor, the goddess of joy, sometimes even Thoth, the keeper of wisdom, perched near the prow like an observant scribe. Below them stretched Egypt, waking to the sound of the river and the cries of ibises. But every sunset the mood shifted. As Ra neared the western horizon, his bark tilted toward the dark mouth of the underworld, the Duat. The living saw only the sun dipping beneath the desert hills, but the Egyptians believed this was when the most dangerous part of his journey began. For in that unseen world, Ra faced his eternal enemy, the serpent Apophis, or Epep, embodiment of chaos and darkness. Imagine it, Ra no longer radiant, but cloaked in twilight, steering his ship through a river of shadows. The walls of the Duat glistened with the bones of serpents, and the stars above flickered faintly like distant torches in a cave. Each night, the gods aboard the bark fought to defend their captain. They wielded spells like swords, chanted hymns like shields, and struck at Apophis's endless coils as the serpent rose from the black waters, fangs dripping with venom capable of swallowing the sun whole. Historians still argue whether this myth was meant to explain natural phenomena, the cycle of day and night, or something deeper, a reflection of human resilience, our need to believe that light always returns. Either way, every dawn was proof of victory. Each sunrise meant Ra had survived once again, piercing the horizon in a blaze of gold, his enemies scattered back into the dark. It's said the priests of Egypt helped him fight. At temples like Heliopolis and Karnak,
They would wake before dawn, chanting the litanies of Ra, striking at images of serpents, and burning wax figures of Apophis to weaken his power. The idea was simple but strangely poetic. If you prayed hard enough, the sun would rise. A comforting thought before alarm clocks existed. As Ra sailed, he passed through 12 gates of the underworld, one for each hour of night. Each gate was guarded by strange beings with names that sounded like passwords from another realm. The Watcher, who burns the unworthy. The Snake, who eats shadows. The One who knows all hearts. The Egyptians loved detail, and their art shows Ra's boat moving hour by hour through these surreal landscapes, fields of fire, lakes of turquoise, caverns filled with souls waiting for judgment. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some versions, Ra traveled with Mayhen, a protective serpent who coiled around the bark to shield it from Apophis. So yes, a snake protected the sun god from another snake. The irony wasn't lost even on the ancients. They saw it as the perfect metaphor. Chaos can only be balanced by controlled chaos. Sometimes other gods joined the voyage. The falcon-headed Horus stood watch at the bow. Thoth scribbled notes on the walls of time. Isis whispered spells to keep the waters calm. And in one particularly mysterious version, the resurrected Osiris rode aboard too, uniting the forces of day and night, life and death. The bark became a floating parliament of divine order, a cosmic cruise ship defending reality itself. But why did Ra have to keep repeating this battle? Why not destroy Apophis once and for all? The Egyptians would smile gently at that question, because they'd say, chaos never truly dies. Every night it rises again, and every morning light must be earned anew. It's not about winning forever, it's about the courage to keep fighting. At dawn, as Ra's bark broke free from the Duat, his light spilled across the land like forgiveness. Farmers looked to the east and bowed. Children stirred in their reed mats. Priests raised their arms and greeted the newborn sun with hymns that echoed like wind through temple columns. Hail to you, Ra, who rises in the horizon. You shine upon the lands and chase away the darkness. One of the most fascinating debates among scholars today concerns the evolution of Ra himself. Was he always the supreme god, or did he rise to prominence later as cities like Heliopolis gained political power? Historians still argue whether Ra's rule was a spiritual inevitability or a reflection of earthly politics, a divine mirror of the pharaoh's ascent. What's certain is that Ra became inseparable from kingship. The pharaoh was called the son of Ra, his authority drawn directly from the sun. When he died, he was said to join Ra's nightly voyage through the underworld, helping to ensure the sun, and by extension Egypt, would rise again. Death wasn't an end for pharaohs, it was a promotion to the cosmic crew. Some later myths even wove in a touch of melancholy. Ra, having ruled for countless ages, grew weary of the world. Humans rebelled, doubting his power. To punish them, he sent the fierce goddess Sekhmet, whose rampage nearly wiped out humanity, until Ra tricked her into drinking red-dyed beer, thinking it was blood. Yes, the world was saved by divine beer pong. Afterward, Ra withdrew to the heavens, letting other gods manage the mess below. Even the sun, it seems, needed a vacation. But no matter how myths shifted, the image of Ra's bark endured. Artists painted it on tomb walls, goldsmiths etched it onto amulets, and storytellers whispered it into eternity. The sound of paddles against black water, the hiss of a serpent rising, the first spark of dawn burning its way back into being. And maybe that's why we still feel something ancient stir inside us when the first light of morning touches our skin. Some deep, half-remembered understanding that the battle has been won again. That
Thanks to a weary god steering a golden ship through the dark, the world has earned one more sunrise.
Beneath the comforting rhythm of the Nile and the steady gaze of the pyramids, Egypt's imagination teemed with strange and wondrous beings, a whole bestiary of spirits, guardians, monsters, and half-divine tricksters. These were not the polished deities of temple walls, but the living echoes of fear, hope, and superstition that filled ordinary life. If Ra ruled the sky and Osiris the underworld, then these creatures ruled the spaces in between, the dusty roads, the silent tombs, the dreams that came after midnight. It began with magic, or Heka, as the Egyptians called it. Heka wasn't a hobby or dark art. It was the natural energy of the universe, the very power that the gods themselves used to shape creation. Every prayer, every amulet, every spell scratched into pottery or papyrus was a thread tugging at the divine fabric of the world. Even Ra was said to have used Heka to rise from the primeval waters of none. Without magic, the cosmos would simply unravel. Priests studied it with devotion, but so did ordinary people. A fisherman might whisper a charm before casting his net. A mother might murmur a spell over her sleeping child, and a farmer might hang a carved eye of Horus above his doorway to ward off sickness. The line between religion and magic didn't exist. It was all one continuous act of faith. Among the many forces of protection, few were as beloved as the goddess Serket, the scorpion lady. She was both healer and avenger, a paradox in divine form. Scorpions, after all, were common in Egypt, their sting swift and deadly, yet Serket turned that fear into safety. She was often shown with a scorpion perched atop her head, arms outstretched as though shielding the living from harm. Her followers believed she guarded the canopic jars of the dead, protecting their organs in the afterlife. There's a strange charm to her duality, deadly venom turned to divine protection. It's the same alchemy we see in medicine today, the poison that becomes the cure. Another protector walked the line between terrifying and comforting. Taweret, the hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. With her plump belly, crocodile tail, and lion's claws, she looked like something out of a fever dream. Yet to expectant mothers, she was a gentle guardian. Clay figurines of her stood on bedside tables across Egypt, watching over births and banishing evil spirits. Imagine that, a pregnant woman whispering a prayer to a crocodile-hippo hybrid and feeling safer for it. Historians still argue whether Taweret began as a household spirit who rose to goddess status, or if she was a divine being whose popularity simply overflowed into every home. Either way, she shows how personal faith could be, the cosmic and the domestic blending seamlessly in everyday life. But not all spirits were friendly. The Egyptian imagination gave shape to every anxiety. In the deserts beyond the Nile, the Red Lands, where the sun scorched and shadows stretched, people believed demons prowled, whispering sickness into the air. Some had names too complex to pronounce, others were just known by what they did. The one who seizes the breath, the eater of shadows, he who binds the limbs. One strange one was Amut, the same devourer who waited beside Osiris's scales. Half lion, half hippopotamus, half crocodile. Yes, 3 halves. Egyptian math was poetic like that. She was feared not for hunting the living, but for feasting on the unworthy dead. Her presence alone was a warning. Live lightly, or you'll never wake in the afterlife. Still, even the demons had purpose. They weren't evil in the modern sense. They were instruments of balance, extensions of Ma'at. They punished wrongdoers, tested souls, and kept the boundaries between worlds intact. Without them, the afterlife would have been overrun by chaos. And chaos, of course, had its own champions. Chief among them was the serpent Apophis, the eternal enemy of Ra. But the Egyptians loved variety in their monsters. There were serpent-headed guardians of the underworld who coiled around tombs to protect or punish the wandering dead. There were fiery cobras called Irai, who spat flames at intruders, often carved into the crowns of kings to symbolize divine wrath. One fringe legend even speaks of a colossal serpent named Nehebkau, who began as a demon feeding on the souls of the dead, but was later redeemed, becoming a god of protection and the binding force between body and soul. It's a bit of mythic character development that wouldn't feel out of place in a modern redemption arc. In the grander temples, high priests performed elaborate rituals to placate these beings, drawing circles of protection, burning incense, chanting secret names. The Egyptians believed that knowing a being's true name granted control over it. That's why Isis could command even Ra when she learned his hidden name. Words were power, and power was survival. The coffin texts and Book of the Dead are filled with such incantations, passwords to ward off demons, maps to avoid cursed gates, hymns to friendly spirits. One spell warns the traveler not to look directly into the eyes of a serpent-headed guardian, while another advises flattering him with compliments instead. Egyptian magic, it seems, came with its own version of customer service diplomacy. And let's not forget Bes, perhaps the most endearing oddball of them all. A dwarf god with a lion's mane, bulging eyes, and his tongue forever sticking out. Bes was the comic relief of the pantheon. He danced, played tambourines, and warded off nightmares. He was the god you wanted at your party, loud, mischievous, but fiercely loyal. Egyptian mothers painted his image on walls to keep their children safe, while soldiers wore his face on amulets before battle. He may have looked ridiculous, but to the people of Egypt, he was family. Archaeologists have even found Bes's face carved into bedposts, furniture, and cosmetic mirrors, proof that humor and holiness weren't enemies in Egyptian thought. One scholar joked that Bes was the only god who would have told you a joke while protecting your dreams. These strange and marvelous beings remind us that Egypt's mythology wasn't a distant, unreachable religion. It was a living reflection of daily life. Every insect bite, every shadow on the wall, every dream or fever had a story behind it. The gods and monsters were simply the shapes people gave to the unknown. And in a way, isn't that still what we do? We turn our fears into characters, our hopes into heroes, and our anxieties into bedtime stories, the same way the Egyptians turned scorpions into goddesses and nightmares into guardians. Their world was alive with symbols, each one reminding them that the universe was vast, mysterious, and, if you treated it with respect, on your side. By now, the gods had shaped the world, the underworld, and even the unseen spaces between. But what of mortals? Those brief flickers of life moving along the Nile. How did they hold their place in such a cosmic order? The answer gleamed in stone and shadow, in vast temples that rose like mountains of devotion. For the Egyptians, faith wasn't something to visit on holy days. It was the pulse of daily existence. And nowhere was that pulse stronger than within their temples, the earthly reflections of divine architecture. To walk through an Egyptian temple was to step into a living body. The outer courtyard was its skin, bright, public, alive with motion and sunlight. Beyond that, the hypostyle halls were its lungs, filled with cool air and the faint echo of footsteps on polished stone. At its heart, hidden behind countless columns and painted ceilings, lay the sanctuary, the heart itself, where the god resided. Only priests and pharaohs could enter that secret chamber. To everyone else, the divine presence remained unseen, but deeply felt, like a heartbeat through walls. These temples were not mere places of worship, they were cosmic engines designed to keep the universe running smoothly. Every column, every carving, every offering was a line of communication between gods and humans. When the priests opened the sanctuary doors at dawn, they weren't just beginning a ritual, they were waking the cosmos itself. The daily temple routine was astonishingly intimate. Before sunrise, the high priest entered the inner chamber barefoot, purified with sacred oils, and softly recited hymns as he unsealed the shrine. Inside stood the statue of the god, not a symbol, but a living embodiment of divine essence. He washed it with perfumed water, anointed it with incense, dressed it in linen, and placed food before it: bread, honey, wine, even roast goose on festival days. It sounds domestic, almost tender, like caring for a beloved guest, but to the Egyptians, this was cosmic maintenance. The god's satisfaction meant prosperity. Neglect meant chaos. The priest would whisper, "Awaken in peace, great one. The world is made ready for you." Here's the fascinating part. Once the god had eaten, the offerings were removed and shared among the priests. A divine meal turned into lunch. Proof that even cosmic rituals come with perks. Historians still argue whether these rituals were performed purely for the gods, or also as political theater to impress the people. After all, the temple wasn't just a holy place, it was a center of power, wealth, and bureaucracy. The temple of Amun at Karnak, for instance, owned farmland, granaries, herds, workshops, and an army of scribes. It was quite literally a city within a city, a divine corporation managed by humans. The priests themselves formed Egypt's most educated class. They were astronomers, doctors, mathematicians, and administrators. Many could read the sacred hieroglyphics that others only dreamed of deciphering. At night, they charted the stars to time rituals precisely. By day, they interpreted omens and dreams for both peasants and pharaohs. But beneath the polished stone and polished manners, the priesthood was not immune to politics. Pharaohs occasionally reorganized temples, which is a polite way of saying they fired the high priests and replaced them with loyal friends. The balance between crown and temple was as delicate as Maat's feather itself. Too much power in one hand, and chaos crept in. Still, the people's faith in the system rarely faltered. They believed that their pharaoh was the living bridge between mortals and gods, the son of Ra, the heir of Horus, the keeper of divine order on earth. When he performed rituals at the temple, it wasn't as a man praying upward. It was as a god reaching outward. His words didn't ask, they commanded the universe to remain in harmony. And when the pharaoh died, that same cycle continued. His body was preserved with exquisite care, wrapped in layers of linen and spell. His tomb was not merely a grave, but a small universe, filled with miniature servants, painted skies, and carved spells to guide him to the bark of Ra. In the next life, he would continue his duty, helping the sun rise, keeping chaos chained. The temples themselves reflected this cosmic continuity. Their walls told stories in color and stone, scenes of creation, battles of gods, royal offerings, even moments of intimacy between kings and their divine patrons. Hieroglyphs weren't just writing, they were living symbols that vibrated with spiritual energy. Egyptians believed that a written word carried a spark of its subject's life. To carve the name of a god or a king was to make them eternal. To erase it, on the other hand, was to kill them all over again. That's why damnatio memoria, the erasure of a ruler's name, was the ultimate punishment. When Hatshepsut, the great female pharaoh, fell out of favor, her successors didn't just take her throne, they chiseled her name from temple walls, attempting to exile her from history and afterlife alike. Ironically, it didn't work. Her monuments endured, and so did her legend. There's a quirky human detail in all this grandeur. Priests often had to shave their entire bodies, including eyebrows, to remain ritually pure. Imagine standing under the blazing Egyptian sun, perfectly bald and oiled, holding incense for hours during ceremonies. Holiness, it seems, required some personal sacrifice and plenty of sunscreen. At festival times, the temples burst into life. Statues of gods were carried out in gilded boats, paraded through crowds as music and laughter filled the air. The Feast of Opet, for example, saw Amun's image journey from Karnak to Luxor Temple, escorted by priests, dancers, and thousands of cheering citizens. For a few golden days, the boundary between divine and mortal dissolved completely. The god was among his people. The people were, for a moment, divine. It's easy to see why Egypt's temples left such a lasting mark. They were spiritual centers, political hubs, and cultural archives all at once. To step inside was to feel connected to the gods, to the pharaoh, to one's ancestors, and to the eternal rhythm of creation. Even now, their ruins still hum faintly with that old magic. If you ever stand in the shadow of a temple column at Karnak, you might feel it. The cool stone breathing with memory, the distant scent of incense long burned away, and the echo of sandals across polished floors as the priests of Amun begin their dawn ritual again. The gods, it seems, were never far, just waiting behind the next column, listening.
Empires rise, rivers shift, and even the gods must learn to travel. As centuries rolled on, Egypt, that seemingly eternal land of stone and sun, opened its borders not just to traders and conquerors, but to ideas. And like the Nile absorbing tributaries from the south and east, Egypt's mythology began to flow outward, mingling with the beliefs of other worlds. The result wasn't loss, but transformation. The old gods finding new faces, new languages, and new hearts across distant shores. It began quietly, through the hum of commerce and the shuffle of diplomats. Nubian kings, Greek philosophers, Persian priests, all passed through the Nile Valley, leaving traces of their own divinities behind. Egypt's priests, ever practical, didn't see these foreign figures as rivals. Instead, they folded them neatly into their cosmic order, interpreting them as new reflections of familiar powers. After all, if the gods were eternal, why shouldn't they appear in different forms, depending on who was looking? The first great wave of blending came from Nubia, Egypt's neighbor to the south. The Nubians worshipped Amun long before they ruled Egypt, but when they conquered the two lands during the 25th dynasty, they brought with them a deeper, more mystical devotion. To them, Amun was not just a king of gods, but the hidden wind, the invisible breath that moved through all creation. At Jebel Barkal, their holy mountain, they built temples that echoed Karnak, proof that divine power could migrate and multiply. The gods were no longer Egyptian alone. They were universal currents flowing through the world. Later came the Greeks, curious, ambitious, and absolutely fascinated by Egypt's ancient wisdom. When Alexander the Great arrived, he wasn't content to just conquer, he wanted to belong. At the Oracle of Siwa, deep in the desert, he was proclaimed the son of Amun. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Macedonian conqueror had joined the lineage of Ra and the pharaohs, cloaking himself in divine legitimacy as smoothly as a priest dons linen. After his death, his general Ptolemy founded a dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, a time when Greek and Egyptian faiths interwove like vines. The Ptolemies built temples that looked ancient even when new, their walls covered in hieroglyphs praising gods whose names the Greeks pronounced in their own tongue. Zeus became equated with Amun, Hermes with Thoth, Aphrodite with Hathor. Even the Greeks, usually so proud of their own pantheon, admitted that Egypt's gods had a kind of seniority, as though their own myths had graduated from Egyptian schools. One of the most remarkable transformations of all was that of Isis. Once the devoted wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, she evolved into something far larger, a goddess of every land, every sea, every heart that longed for protection. The Greeks adored her, calling her Isis Panthea, meaning Isis of all. Her temple spread across the Mediterranean, from Alexandria to Athens, from Rome to London. Sailors prayed to her before voyages, merchants kept her amulets for luck, and philosophers wrote hymns to her wisdom. The Roman writer Apuleius described her as the face of all gods and goddesses, a divine mother who transcended borders. It's strange, almost poetic, an Egyptian goddess born in the marshes of the Nile, ending up honored on the cliffs of Italy. You could say she was the first truly global deity. Historians still argue whether Isis's rise to international fame was religious or political, whether her cult spread because she offered genuine spiritual comfort or because her image symbolized stability in turbulent times. But perhaps the truth lies in both. Isis represented love that endures loss, life that defies death, themes that never go out of fashion, even 2 millennia later. Her companion gods, too, found new homes. Osiris merged with the Greek Dionysus, both gods of death and rebirth, both patrons of the mysteries of life. Horus became linked with Apollo, the ever-shining one, while Anubis blended with Hermes to form Hermanubis, a guide for souls across worlds. The underworld grew crowded with hybrid figures, part Greek philosopher, part Egyptian judge, as the ancient Nile beliefs met the marble temples of the West. Yet amid all this blending, Egypt didn't lose itself. If anything, its influence deepened. The temples of Dendera and Philae, built under Greek and Roman rule, gleamed with hieroglyphs praising Isis and Hathor in the same tones that priests had used 1,000 years earlier. Pilgrims still came with offerings of bread and lotus, still whispered prayers for fertility, still trusted the old magic to keep the balance. A quirky but telling detail. Some of the last hieroglyphs ever carved in Egypt appear on the walls of the Temple of Philae, and they praise Isis. Even as the Roman Empire turned to new gods, Egypt's faithful continued to light lamps in her honor. The language may have changed, but the devotion did not. As cultures intertwined, Egypt became a spiritual crossroads. Persian dualism, Greek philosophy, and even early Jewish mysticism absorbed hints of its cosmic order, the weighing of souls, the journey through the underworld, the hope of renewal. The image of a radiant maternal goddess watching over humankind would echo centuries later in Christian veneration of Mary. The notion of the eternal soul facing judgment after death found its way into countless religions. Egypt's myths didn't die. They evolved into the world's shared mythology. And yet there was something bittersweet in this transformation. The old priests watched as Greek became the language of scholars, as new gods spoke with foreign accents. The temples still echoed with chants, but the Nile had a way of remembering. The wind that rustled through papyrus reeds carried the same songs it always had. Hymns to a sun that never failed to rise, to a mother that never stopped searching, to a universe that still believed in balance. If you stood in Alexandria at twilight during those centuries, you might have seen it, the golden light catching on a statue of Isis by the harbor, her face calm, timeless, the same expression she'd worn in Thebes 1,000 years before. The language around her had changed, the empire had changed, but she remained, the eternal mother, sailing not just the Nile now, but the seas between worlds. For most civilizations, time buries gods as surely as it buries bones, but Egypt is different. Its gods never stayed buried. Even when their temples fell silent, their eyes, carved in stone, kept watching. Their names slept beneath sand and script, waiting, and when the modern world finally learned to read them again, the old gods awoke once more. The story of their rebirth begins not with a priest or prophet, but with a scholar and a broken slab of stone, the Rosetta Stone, found in 1799. 3 scripts carved into one decree, Greek, Demotic, and Hieroglyphs, a puzzle that would bridge millennia. When Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in 1822, Egypt's long-lost voice returned. Every temple wall, every tomb inscription, every coffin spell could speak again. The world listened in awe. Suddenly, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and Ra stepped back into the light. Their hymns were translated, their myths retold. The Book of the Dead, once whispered only by priests, became a bestseller among Victorian readers. Scholars marveled at the precision of Egypt's theology, its cosmic order, its vision of moral judgment, its obsession with eternity. Artists and poets, hungry for mystery, found in Egypt a kind of sacred otherworld that no Greek marble could match. The 19th century became a golden age of rediscovery and obsession. Explorers braved the desert heat, prying open tombs sealed for 3,000 years. Every discovery felt like an echo from eternity. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, the colossal statues of Abu Simbel, the hidden corridors of the Valley of the Kings. Newspapers printed the finds with breathless wonder. Egyptomania swept through Europe. Women wore lotus jewelry. Men smoked from pipes shaped like sphinxes, and parlors filled with painted scarabs and papyrus scrolls. The ancient faith had turned into fashion. But fascination has a way of turning into myth once again. The modern world began to reimagine the gods, reshaping them through novels, paintings, and later, film. In the 1920s, after Tutankhamun's tomb was opened, rumors of the pharaoh's curse spread like wildfire. Every archaeologist's death became a headline, every shadow in a tomb a ghost story. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Egypt had reclaimed its magic. The gods had learned a new language, that of cinema and sensation. In the decades that followed, Egyptian imagery became a visual shorthand for mystery, power, and immortality. The pyramids, once monuments of devotion, became symbols of eternal endurance and, sometimes, of horror. Mummies lurched onto movie screens, priests of Ra chanted in pulp novels, and Isis reappeared as both a goddess and a metaphor, the eternal woman, the keeper of secrets, the mother of magic. The irony was striking. Egypt's mythology, born from a quest for immortality, had achieved it not through religion, but through reinvention. Every generation found something new in those ancient forms. To the Victorians, Egypt was exotic mystery. To the 20th century, it was cinematic fantasy. To today's storytellers, it's a mirror for humanity's oldest questions: life, death, order, chaos, and the longing to outlast time itself. Pop culture made sure of it. In comic books, Isis and Anubis stand beside superheroes. In video games, Horus spreads his wings across digital skies. In films, the pyramids rise again, sometimes in glory, sometimes in ruin, but always with the same quiet gravity. Even science fiction borrows Egypt's cosmic imagery: golden ships shaped like obelisks, alien gods named Ra. The line between myth and imagination blurs. as if the ancient stories were never myths at all, but memories of something older than belief. And the influence runs deeper than surface aesthetics. Egypt's concept of ma'at, truth, balance, justice, continues to echo in modern philosophy and ethics. Its idea of judgment after death shaped early Christian and Islamic visions of the afterlife. Even the very image of resurrection, of life continuing beyond the tomb, owes something to Osiris's green hands reaching up from the underworld. The Egyptian heart, weighed against the feather, still beats inside humanity's moral imagination. Today, tourists walk through Luxor with smartphones raised, capturing the same hieroglyphs once whispered over by priests. Museums preserve what once belonged to eternity, a paradox Egypt itself might have appreciated. The gods now live not in temples, but in pixels and pages. Yet somehow their presence feels no less powerful. If you visit Cairo or Thebes at sunset, when the desert turns gold and the air hums with silence, you might feel it, that soft stirring of something ancient beneath the dust. The same air once breathed by pharaohs, the same stars that watched over Isis and Osiris. The myths may be retold through screens and scripts, but their roots remain sunk deep in the Nile's black earth, timeless, patient, eternal. Because Egypt's greatest magic was never in its gold or its gods, but in its endurance. Civilizations rise and crumble, empires forget, languages fade, but the stories of Egypt refuse to die. They adapt, they survive, they change shape like the sun god Ra on his endless journey through the night, reborn with every dawn. And perhaps that's the secret the ancients knew all along. Immortality isn't about never dying. It's about being remembered and retold forever.
Night descends upon the desert, slow, deliberate, and impossibly vast. The last shimmer of sunlight slips behind the pyramids, leaving a faint blush of gold on the horizon before giving way to violet, then to indigo. The sands cool, sighing softly under the wind's fingers. Somewhere, the Nile still murmurs, that same steady pulse that has never once stopped since the first story was told. In the silence that follows, it feels as if Egypt itself is breathing. The tombs beneath the dunes hum faintly, their walls covered in spells that no longer need to be read. The gods do not walk openly anymore, yet their shadows linger in the stars. Ra's bark glides unseen through the underworld. Horus spreads invisible wings across the constellations, and Osiris waits in the field of reeds where no sandstorm ever blows. The ancient Egyptians believed the night sky was a great ocean, and that each star was a soul sailing through eternity. Even now, when astronomers name those same points of light, some part of that belief remains. Every human gaze turned upward repeats the same old wonder: what lies beyond, and who is watching back? Historians still argue whether Egyptian astronomy was truly scientific or purely spiritual, but perhaps it was always both. Their constellations were not just stars, they were stories pinned to the heavens, proof that myth itself was a map. Down on the ground, the ruins rest quietly. The temples of Luxor, the columns of Karnak, the half-buried sphinxes staring east, all frozen mid-breath, mid-prayer. Stone remembers, even when people forget. Each carving still hums with a kind of reverence, a low vibration of devotion meant to last beyond empire, beyond decay. And maybe that's why, even now, when you stand among those ancient stones, you feel less like a visitor and more like someone returning. The wind moves softly through broken halls. A falcon cries high above the cliffs of Dar el-Bahari, perhaps just a bird, or perhaps a whisper from Horus himself. The boundary between sacred and ordinary blurs, as it always did in Egypt. The ancients never truly separated myth from life. The divine was simply woven into everything. into the smell of lotus on the river, into the warmth of the sun, into the laughter of children chasing each other through temple courtyards. And so the gods endure, not through worship, but through memory. Isis still mothers the world in every act of care. Osiris still rules every act of renewal. Ma'at still balances every truth we speak out loud. Ra still rises each morning, if only as the golden circle that climbs over Cairo's skyline. The gods do not die because they are built from ideas humanity cannot stop needing. They are hope and fear and justice and love, carved in divine form. Somewhere beyond time, they are still gathered, the old family, the first gods. Nut stretches across the cosmos, her body arched with starlight. Jeb lies below, his laughter rumbling through the earth. Shu and Tefnut drift like the air and mist between them. Atum watches from the horizon, content that creation continues. Osiris and Isis sit side by side, Horus at their feet, and even Set, stormy, restless, keeps his distance but does not turn away. Eternity has softened their quarrels. The balance holds. Perhaps if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint echoes of their hymns, the same words once sung by temple choirs in candlelight, now carried only by the desert wind. The cadence of ancient prayers still drifts across the dunes, mixed with the hum of the living world. And in that hum lies Egypt's true secret. It never ended. The Nile still flows, the stars still burn, and the sand still hides as much as it reveals. Every generation rediscovers these stories, retelling them in new tongues, under new skies, but always with the same heartbeat. The gods, it seems, have simply changed their stage. So as the night deepens and the stars sharpen against the black sky, Egypt lies silent, but never still. The myths dissolve into the wind, into the ripples of the river, into the quiet awe of anyone who listens long enough. They were never just stories, they were blueprints for eternity.